It was the night of the 31st of October 1999 when EgyptAir Flight 990 crash would become one of the most baffling tragedies in modern civil aviation, an event layered with technical puzzles, human drama and geopolitical tensions. The aircraft, a Boeing 767-366, a registered SU-GAP, had taken off from John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York at approximately 1:20 EST, bound for Cairo International Airport via an overnight transatlantic leg (NTSB+1). On board were 203 passengers and 14 crew, a total of 217 souls. NTSB+1. The flight began uneventfully. The aircraft climbed to its cruising altitude of 33,000 feet and leveled off. According to radar and flight recorder data, all was normal in the early part of the leg. Encyclopedia Britannica +1. Then, at approximately 1:49 EST, the aircraft suddenly began a rapid descent. The exact sequence of events is complex, but what emerges from the record is chilling. The autopilot was disengaged, the elevators moved to force a nose-down attitude, the airspeed rose to near max speeds, and the engines were shut down. Aviation for aviators.com +2 NTSB +2. In the cockpit voice recorder, CVR, an unusual phrase was captured. The relief first officer reportedly uttered in Arabic talk called Allah, "I rely on God," multiple times. Wikipedia +1. That phrase, and the actions that followed, have haunted investigators and the families of the victims ever since. As the aircraft descended, the captain returned to the cockpit. He found the controls not responding to his inputs as the aircraft, already past its safe structural and aerodynamic envelope, began to break apart before plunging into the Atlantic Ocean approximately 60 miles south of Nantucket Island, Massachusetts. Wikipedia +1. All 217 on board perished. What happened in those minutes? Who or what caused the crash? The investigation that followed was fraught with controversy, at times bitter disagreement, and left major questions unanswered. A key tension emerged between the investigative authority of the United States, the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, and the Egyptian counterpart, the Egyptian Civil Aviation Authority, ECA. The NTSB concluded that the crash was a result of intentional flight control inputs by the relief first officer, but the ECA strongly disagreed and attributed the accident to mechanical failure. Wikipedia +1. To understand the depth of the mystery, one must step through the timeline, study the evidence, analyze the theories, and reflect on what was left unresolved. It begins with the aircraft, the crew, and the flight itself. The aircraft, Boeing 767-366 SU-GAP, was in service with EgyptAir and had accumulated around 33,000 flight hours. Aviationfile.com. It was maintained according to standard procedures. No major unresolved maintenance items were publicly highlighted in the accident report. The flight plan called for the long overnight leg from New York to Cairo, and the crew composition included a captain, first officer, and relief crew. The relief first officer, a man named Gamil Alabatouti, would later become a central figure in the investigation. Wikipedia +1. At some point, the captain left the cockpit, to use the lavatory, and the relief first officer was alone in the cockpit. It was soon after this that autopilot disengaged and abnormal control inputs began. The NTSB's analysis of the flight data recorder, FDR, and CVR indicates that the relief first officer placed the control yoke forward, putting the nose down, and maintained that input. The elevator surfaces moved asymmetrically, one side commanding a climb, the other a descent, which forensic aerodynamic analysis showed could only happen if opposing control inputs were being applied by two different pilots at the same time, or that someone deliberately manipulated the controls while another attempted to correct. Wikipedia +1. When the captain returned, he attempted to regain control, pulling back on the column, applying full throttle, deploying the speed brakes, yet the plane remained outside its safe flight envelope. The left engine separated, and structural forces ripped the aircraft apart before impact with the ocean. NTSB +1. The investigation then turned to the motive, Why would the relief first officer do this? Or could it truly have been a mechanical failure? The NTSB, after exhaustive testing of proposed mechanical failure scenarios, concluded no mechanical fault could replicate the flight profile and elevator behavior. Their 2002 report states, the probable cause of the EgyptAir Flight 990 accident is the airplane's departure from normal cruise flight and subsequent impact with the Atlantic Ocean as a result of the relief first officer's flight control inputs. The reason for the relief first officer's actions was not determined. NTSB +1. In contrast, the Egyptian investigation by the EgyptAir concluded that the relief first officer did not deliberately dive the airplane into the sea, and that mechanical failure was a plausible and likely cause of the accident. Wikipedia +1. Thus a gulf opened, a U.S. regulatory authority pointing to pilot intervention, an Egyptian regulatory body pointing to mechanical failure, and no definitive explanation accepted universally. Families of victims, aviation professionals, journalists and analysts remain divided. Let us examine the major theories. Deliberate pilot action, suicide or mass murder scenario. The strongest case made by the NTSB is that the relief first officer deliberately manipulated the controls. The evidence, the autopilot disengagement, the sustained nose-down inputs, the shutdown of both engines, the elevator asymmetry, and the repeated phrase "talk all to Lala." Many interpret the phrase as indicating the first officer knew the outcome and consciously proceeded. Wikipedia +1. Further, the aircraft's behavior cannot be explained by any known mechanical failure when tested in simulation. Supporters of this theory note that for the first officer to make an unauthorized command, shut down the engines, ignore the captain's returns, and let the aircraft dive indicates intent. One aviation investigative blogger stated, "We may never know exactly why Gamil al-Baitouti deliberately dived EgyptAir Flight 990 into the sea a broken bar, but that he did. A broken bar is indisputable." Medium. Critics of the pilot intent theory argue that for such an extraordinary conclusion the evidence should be incontrovertible, yet motive remains unclear, and some of the behavioral interpretations, especially of the Arabic phrase, may be culturally biased or misinterpreted. The EgyptAir and others asked, would a first officer shut down both engines at cruise altitude, invite structural overload, and then leave no note? Does this match known suicide or malicious pilot behaviors? They argue number. Mechanical failure, malfunction scenario. Egyptian authorities and some independent analysts advanced mechanical or structural failure as the cause. Proposed failure modes included elevator control system malfunction, autopilot failure, uncommanded thrust reverser deployment, echoing the earlier Lord Air Flight 004 crash on a Boeing 767 in 1991, and failure of the aircraft's right elevator. The Egyptian report concluded that mechanical failure was a plausible and likely cause. Wikipedia +1. Critics of this theory pointed out that the NTSB performed extensive modeling and lab testing of failure modes and found none that explained the elevator asymmetry or simultaneous engine shutdown. They argue that mechanical failure rarely results in the kinds of deliberate or sustained control inputs seen in this case, and that flight path analysis is more consistent with human action than an uncontrolled mechanical failure. NTSB. Terrorism or external interference. In the immediate aftermath of the crash there was speculation about terrorism, sabotage or external attack. Among the passengers were a number of Egyptian military officers returning from training in the US, which led to suggestions the flight may have been targeted. Wired +1. Some pointed out the suddenness of the event, the lack of distress call, and the nature of the dive as unusual. But no credible evidence of bomb, missile or external attack was found, and the NTSB did not endorse a terrorism cause. The EgyptAir likewise found no support for this scenario publicly. Aviation for aviators.com. Each theory carries strengths and weaknesses. The pilot intent theory explains the control inputs, asymmetry, engine shutdown and dive path, but lacks a clearly established motive and leaves cultural interpretation questions. The mechanical theory provides an alternative which might be more palatable to some stakeholders. but struggles to replicate the exact flight profile. The external attack theory remains speculative and unsupported by physical forensic evidence. Beyond cause, the investigation raised important questions about safety, procedure, cockpit culture, human factors and international investigative cooperation. For one, this accident highlighted the importance of obtaining and analyzing cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder information in complex scenarios. The CVR in this case had channels with varying clarity and some loss of capture of the captain's microphone channel. ABC News. Some analysts note that if cockpit video had existed, it might have provided more clarity to the struggle, if any, that occurred between the crew members. Medium. Another point, the notion of two-person rule in the cockpit, that one pilot does not leave the cockpit alone, gained additional attention after Flight 990. Some U.S. carriers adopted stricter policies requiring another crew member to be present if one pilot left the flight deck, so that one person is never left alone at the controls. This was partly because the sequence of events began while the captain was absent. Medium. The international dimension. Because the aircraft was registered in Egypt and the crash occurred in international waters off the U.S. coast, the investigation involved multiple agencies: the U.S. NTSB, the Egyptian EgyptAir, the U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, the U.S. Coast Guard, FAR, Boeing, and others. Wikipedia +1. The EgyptAir felt from the outset that its investigation was being marginalized, and as the NTSB moved toward its conclusion of pilot intent, tensions rose. Some Egyptian officials believed that the U.S. side was emphasizing an intentional act for cultural or political reasons and objected to what they regarded as a rush to judgment. Al Jazeera. And the families of the victims, for them the lack of unanimity in findings has been deeply unsatisfying. Knowing what caused the crash matters not only for closure but for insurance, legal and regulatory implications. The insistence of the Egyptian side on mechanical failure and the US side on intentional control input has left many without a clear, shared understanding of what happened. Some commentators wrote that the story of Flight 990 will haunt aviation safety because no single explanation commanded universal acceptance. Simple flying. Let us step back and reflect on the human side. On board that flight were hundreds of people with hopes, lives and families. At around 1:20 the passengers boarded, settled in for the overnight leg. Among them were Egyptian officers returning home from training, Americans, Canadians and Egyptians. Many were likely asleep. The flight was nighttime over the Atlantic, lights below diminishing, fatigue present. Outside, the weather was calm. Visual meteorological conditions prevailed. NTSB +1. Then suddenly, the aircraft pitched down. The passengers would have experienced a brief weightlessness, the disorienting feeling of falling, then a plunging dive, the sudden increase of speed, the aerodynamic stress, the noise, perhaps screams, the structural failure, and ultimately impact with the sea. One might imagine the terror of those final moments, the helplessness. One analyst asked, what were the last words of the captain to his first officer? What did the passengers feel? Medium. For the flight crew, the relief first officer may have been acting. Some suggest he made an early request to begin duty ahead of schedule, found himself alone, disconnected autopilot, forced the dive. Others suggest he shut down the engines intentionally. The captain returned too late. The aircraft exceeded its design limits. Left engine separated. The fuselage broke apart in midair. Wreckage fell into the ocean. The CVR and FDR eventually ceased recording. The transponder stopped reporting. Wikipedia +1. In the wreckage recovery, the U.S. Coast Guard and other agencies utilized side-scan sonar, deep-sea survey vessels and other technology. The debris field was located on the Atlantic floor, the search hampered by weather and depth. Encyclopedia Britannica. Wreckage examination revealed structural overload, engine separation and the condition of the CVR, damage to enclosure but memory preserved, yielding audio data. ABC News. Another dimension, culture, politics and organizational behavior. Some Egyptian officials felt the NTSB's portrayal of the relief first officer as intentionally diving the aircraft was incompatible with how he was viewed in EgyptAir as a professional, experienced pilot, regarded highly by his colleagues, with no known suicidal history. The idea that he would commit such an act was deeply challenging to accept. The Egyptian report emphasized the possibility of mechanical failure, not intentional action. Wikipedia. On the US side, the NTSB emphasized the technical evidence, stating that simulations of mechanical failures did not produce the same combination of inputs and resulting flight path. The NTSB's conclusion deliberately stated the reason for the relief first officer's actions was not determined, acknowledging uncertainty even as they laid the decision on his control inputs. NTSB. Thus, the mystery, the how is largely known, but the why remains elusive. Why did the relief first officer make those inputs? Was he acting out of emotional stress, disgruntlement, suicidal intent, ideological motive, or was he trying to respond to a hidden malfunction? Was there a subtle mechanical failure misinterpreted as intentional action? Or was there sabotage? Each possibility has been proposed, each challenged. What lessons emerged from Flight 990? First, the importance of full data capture of voice, video, flight parameters and the benefit of rigorous cross-agency investigation. Second, aviation has to consider the possibility of intentional pilot acts in safety modeling, however rare. Third, communication and trust between investigating authorities, especially when multiple nations are involved, matter deeply for final conclusions and for the families of victims. Finally, procedures such as the two-person cockpit rule became more widely discussed, yet the emotional currency of the event remains high, for families, for investigators, and for the aviation community. A crash wherein the cause remains partly disputed leaves a residue of doubt. What if the first officer was innocent and mechanical failure did this? What if he deliberately destroyed the aircraft and took hundreds with him? Neither answer provides a comfortable closure. In the end, the story of EgyptAir Flight 990 stands as a cautionary tale. A flight that should have been routine became a tragedy. The aircraft plunged from cruise altitude into darkness and the sea. The investigation produced a formal conclusion, yet one not accepted universally. The mystery lingers. Even more than 2 decades on, one finds commentators writing that we may never know exactly why the tragedy occurred. Medium. The everyday lives of those 217 people ended in a moment of chaos and finality. Their families still seek answers. Aviation safety has been enhanced in many ways, but the human cost remains undiminished. Thus the mystery of EgyptAir Flight 990 persists. The evidence points strongly to deliberate flight control inputs by the relief first officer. Their motive remains unidentified. The alternative of mechanical failure remains plausible to some. No definitive, uncontested explanation has emerged. The flight may remain a somber footnote in aviation history, but it carries lessons for all who fly, for all who design aircraft, for all who investigate. And for every time we board an aircraft, we might spare a moment to remember that human lives, machines, decisions, and unknown impulses converged at 1:52 a.m. EST on the 31st of October 1999, over the Atlantic, for one last time.